Hi, everyone. I had a great conversation recently with Zach Wagner, who is the author of the recent book Non-Toxic Masculinity, which came out from IVP. Already released a video review of the book on my channel, so you can check that out if you're interested in that first. But our conversation ranges from Zach's personal story, and then I respond with how some of it intersects with my personal story. We both, at the same age, grew up in similar evangelical cultures, so we talk a lot about that. A lot of our conversation revolves around unpacking purity culture, defining what was harmful about it, and a lot of that gets into unpacking and defining his alternative proposition of non-toxic masculinity. And then finally, in the last section of our conversation, we get into kind of responding to the whole Josh Butler Gospel Coalition theology of sex controversy that's been kind of around evangelical culture in recent months. So that last 10 to 15 minutes or so may be a little bit inside baseball if you're not in evangelical culture or kind of American Christian culture. But if you are, you might find that particularly interesting. So know that we get into that at the end. But regardless, I found Zach to be kind of a kindred spirit. I really enjoyed talking to him. We have very similar backgrounds and stories, as you'll see if you watch this video. And it was just a joy to get to talk to the author of this book a little bit. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Without any further ado, give you Zach Wagner. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. So I am really excited to sit here with Zach Wagner, have a conversation about his new book. It's about a month out or so, is that right?
Yeah, officially about month and a half, I guess, coming up on
Okay.
April 4th was the release date.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. I guess time is moving. But Non-Toxic Masculinity came out from IVP. I posted a review of the book on the channel, and I'm excited to have some dialogue about the contents of the book, maybe in a little bit more of a long form, deeper way
Sure.
than what I could get into on the review. So thank you, Zach, for jumping
Yeah,
on.
great to be here. Thanks for the invite, Joel. Looking
Yeah,
forward to the conversation.
I'm excited about it. So I want to start with a kind of a maybe this is a softball question. Good thing to get things going, but why? I mean, I think I know what you're gonna say, but why write this book now? And you can talk about the book has a lot of
Sure.
memoir in it, so you could talk about it
Mm.
personally, or maybe socially, culturally, maybe both. But just where do you want to
Well,
go with that
yeah,
question?
you're definitely anticipating the answer because this is in, the conversations and podcast interviews and things like that I've been doing for the book. 4 times out of 5 or more, this is some version of this question is first,
Hmm.
and I am trying to condense my answer, but it gets a little overlong. So,
Hmm.
but you anticipated exactly the two categories. There's kind of a personal component to why I decided to write the book, and then the kind of broader church
Yeah.
culture, social dynamics, cultural commentary stuff. So I'll start with the personal, in that I grew up in a conservative, majority white, evangelical context, suburban, I
Hmm.
imagine familiar to a lot of folks who might be reading books from IVP or
Yeah. Yeah.
listening to a YouTube conversation about a book published by IVP, know that world and grew
Yep.
up in it. And a huge component of my upbringing, both in home and in church, and the books that I was reading, was what is often described today as "quote unquote" purity culture. And
Mm.
there has been purity culture has not fared well, has not aged well
Yeah.
over the past few decades, and it's often closely associated with Joshua Harris
Hmm.
and Kiss Dating Goodbye books, as well as True Love Waits and different conferences and events, and Elizabeth
Hmm.
Elliot, and you can rattle all these things off. Really, really influential kind of movement of resources and events and rhetoric around that, and that was very much part of my upbringing.
Mm.
I came of age, what I would think historically you could describe as the height, and I shouldn't say came of age. I went through puberty at the height of purity culture in the early aughts,
Mm.
um, and yeah, I'm meandering a little bit, but
Okay.
in recent years, maybe over the past 7 years or so, there have been a number of books kind of
Yeah.
quote unquote deconstructing or critiquing or reevaluating or just even historically tracing this movement, this purity movement in the United States in the 90s and the early aughts, like I say. Interestingly, Not,
pause on that for a second?
yeah, please.
I wanna pick this up in a minute because this is a huge purity culture is a huge foundation in your book, obviously.
Hmm.
How would you let me just ask this question and then we'll get back into your story. How would you
Sure.
describe purity culture to someone who did not grow up in what you and I both grew up in?
Oh, someone who didn't grow up in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would think similarly to how I define it in the book, in that it's a cultural movement in response to another broader cultural movement.
Mm.
So if the broader cultural movement is the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s,
Mm-hmm.
purity culture, it seems to me, is a subcultural movement within the Christian evangelical bubble, such as it was, which
Mm-hmm.
is huge. You say subculture, but that's not a small segment of the culture.
Yeah.
And these books sold, several of them sold millions of copies,
Yeah.
or well over a million copies. Um, so it's a subcultural movement in response to the broader cultural movement. It's the way that Christians tried to commend a traditional understanding of sexuality, including things like sexes ought to be reserved for marriage,
Mm-hmm.
and even this wasn't as much of a conversation during the height of the purity movement, but certainly an emphasis on heterosexuality over and against homosexuality,
Right.
um,
Gender roles.
gender roles, yes, all of these
Mm-hmm.
things.
Mm-hmm.
And it was characterized by a kind of popular subcultural outflow of resources and events, like I've already said.
Mm-hmm.
So very popular books, very popular events, and just kind of vibe within the conservative
Yeah.
Christian church, I would say.
It's interesting to
I
frame
feel
it
like,
as
yeah, go
like
ahead.
I was just gonna say it's interesting to frame it as a generational thing too. Like
Hmm.
it's interesting to I'm getting a little bit out of my I'm not a historian per se, but
Nor
it's
am I.
interesting to think about it as a movement in response to what you just said, but also um, from the parents who grew up in the sexual
That's
revolution
right.
era and were reckoning with it as they had kids on a generational
Yes.
level. That's just a fascinating way to
Yes.
conceive of this whole thing. So I just want to add that.
Yeah, yeah, and all not to get too sidetracked on this
It's
from
okay.
the original question, but this is how this goes,
Yeah, exactly.
here.
We'll get back to it.
So I think that's pretty right, or at least a valid way of looking at
Mm-hmm.
this.
Mm-hmm.
Something I don't know. I trace a generational history of the
Yep.
purity movement in the second chapter of my book, or I suppose it's depending on how you count the introduction versus
Right.
the first body chapter. And I think purity culture can accurately be described as a intergenerational dynamic between baby boomers
Mm-hmm.
and their millennial children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people who grew up in purity culture will resonate with that. This was something
Yep.
about my parents growing up in the
Yep.
60s and 70s,
Mm-hmm.
and then me growing up in the 90s and the 2000s,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that created an interesting dynamic.
Yep. Yep.
And
And do you talk
uh,
about? I think you talk about how Gen X was almost deployed. The Josh
yes,
Harrises were kind of
yes,
deployed as these like tool sounds a little harsh, but like I think you know what I mean. Like they were deployed by the boomers to implement this
yes,
agenda because maybe they were younger, more hip, more a little bit
that's
could
exactly
speak the
it.
language.
Yes,
And that I had never heard someone before I read your book. I never heard anyone frame it up that way, but that resonated on a gut level for me. Be like, yeah, I
for
feel like
sure.
that's what happened. Like I was almost again, I'm using strong language here. I do want to be one thing I like about your book is the sympathy you bring to understanding like what was happening, trying to have
Mm,
like a steelman approach to like here's kind of the best intent of the purity culture movement. But
yes,
like I do remember feeling like, oh, like Josh Harris seems cool. You know,
yes,
I should I guess read his book and like it. And like feeling like
yeah,
I want to be cool. And but seeing these dynamics in a much bigger generational sense is very illuminating. So I just
yes,
underline that.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess so. I'll pick up on
Yeah, please. Yep.
the why I wrote this. So there have been these kind of post purity culture books, and across a pretty wide ideological spectrum, actually,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of kind of post evangelical, even academic historical treatments, or even post Christian assessments of purity culture. But there have also been some more conservative critiques.
Yep.
I would think of Rachel Welcher's Talking Back to Purity Culture in that
Yeah.
category for sure, and there have
Mm-hmm.
been other books that lean that direction. But interestingly, with the one exception of Matthias Roberts' book Beyond Shame,
Mm.
he's coming from a psychological perspective. He's a gay man and speaks a lot out of that experience in that book. But the thing I keep almost saying and then getting distracted is that all of these almost have been written by women.
Right.
And there was, I think, as I was, along with a lot of people, kind of re-evaluating the sexual inheritance, or I guess theology of sexuality that I inherited.
Mm-hmm.
I heard more than one person say, yeah, purity culture really screwed over women because it objectified them and it put all the responsibility on them,
Mm-hmm.
and left them vulnerable to abuse and dehumanization and all these things. And that's all very true. But a lot of times what people would say next was, and the guys just kind of got off scot-free. Like they
Mm-hmm.
were kind of coddled, and the world was shaped to make women their servants and all of
Mm-hmm.
this. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying there's no validity to that, but in my experience, I was like, man, I don't feel like purity culture was a good deal for me. Like,
Yeah.
I carry a lot
Yeah.
of really difficult stuff from my experience growing up
Yeah.
in that, and guys I would talk to spoke similarly.
Yes.
So that particular kind of way of speaking about it as this kind of all one-sided system that favored men, and in a kind of holistic way, and disadvantaged women in a holistic way. I think there was a little nuance that I was kind of longing for
Yeah. It's a
in the
little too simple.
conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And then of course and I go into this in the book, in my personal experience, like many, men of my generation, not only are you getting all this purity culture rhetoric if you grew up in the church, but high-speed internet, smartphones,
Mm-hmm.
just about every guy you talk to was quote unquote struggling with viewing pornography, masturbating, all of this around those kind of teen and college years, especially.
Mm-hmm.
And that was certainly part of my experience as well. So on the one hand, you're getting this, like, keep it in your pants or your life will be ruined, and don't ever
Right.
have an impure thought
Yeah.
under any circumstances. And then this really pronounced struggle, despite reading Everman's Battle and
Right.
memorizing the verses and all of that, with pornography in particular. And
Mm.
then had varying degrees of success on that. But I did end up getting married after undergrad, and so much of the incentive in purity culture for remaining abstinent until marriage is to guarantee a
Yeah.
free and frequent and fulfilling sex life in your marriage,
Mm-hmm.
even at, like, as shallow as on your honeymoon, which
Yeah.
is interesting in
Yeah.
retrospect.
Oh
And
man. Yeah.
I found, and we can get into that,
Yeah.
but I found in my experience that was very much not the case. My
Mm-hmm.
wife Shelby and I, and she's very happy for me to talk about this and be sharing
She wrote the
about
foreword
our
to your book.
story. She did write
Mm-hmm.
she wrote the preface to the book, and
That was a
kind of
really
gives.
meaningful touch, I thought.
Yeah, she and I were talking about it, and it was really her. It was her idea. Like,
Mm.
I shouldn't really take any credit for it. And we talked about it, and I'm so happy with how it turned out, because some of the early readers and friends who were looking things over as in the writing process flagged, like, how does Shelby feel about you
Yeah.
sharing
Sure.
all of this?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I would say, like, oh, she's so supportive, she's really excited about it, she really believes in the project, she's very open. And they're like, okay, I guess I believe you.
Yeah.
And it
Right.
was
Yeah.
it was like, so yeah, really happy with the fact that we decided to go that direction, and
Well, and
thanks
those
to
who are
Shelby.
watching this should know, I think in a very good and appropriate way, you are very raw with your story
Mm,
and vulnerable.
mm,
And I want to say too, with the memoir elements, It feels like what you're trying to do with this project, in light of what you just said a minute ago, is in a way speak honestly about how men have been harmed by purity culture.
Mm-hmm.
And what you said earlier is like men got off scot-free, which is, I completely agree with you, is just 100% not true. So how do you talk? But here's where I feel like in our cultural context it's a little bit fraught, which is to say, how do you talk honestly about how men have been harmed without centering male experiences in a way that
Great question.
is perpetuating the marginalization of women's voices, like all that stuff, which is very legitimate consideration.
Sure.
But nevertheless, the harms that men have endured need to be talked openly about. All I'm trying to say is I'm trying to acknowledge how I think you threaded that needle really well with having Shelby write the intro to your book,
Yes.
actually. And she
Mm,
essentially says something along those lines, like, this has my endorsement and my full-throated support for putting this story out there because it is important. And
mm,
speaking as someone who underwent, I suspect, well, I know because I read the book, very similar internal psychological harm and baggage, and
sure.
went through a lot of that stuff. Like, reading your story and seeing it so plainly spoken on those pages was a visceral experience for me to respond to. It's like, oh, I'm
Mm,
so thankful that there's some words to this that are coming from another person, another man who grew up in it. So that's another rambly response to it. But
mm,
I just want to, for those who are watching and haven't read the book, that's kind of what we're talking about, is the tone of the memoir elements. And um, I feel like you, as I could tell from your writing style, I feel like you were trying to be sensitive to all these cultural dynamics as you were putting that story out there. So
yeah.
I don't
Well,
know what that sparks a
thank
response.
thanks for well, just thanks for saying that.
Sure.
You know, it was a fraught process kind of
Mm-hmm.
just entering into this and
Yeah.
writing it, and emotionally, because of the way it is personally kind of part of my story, and not just part of my story but part of my marriage,
Sure.
as
Yeah.
I've already said. And that's very vulnerable to,
Mm-hmm.
in a try to, in a way that is honest and honoring of, like mine and Shelby's privacy, I
Right.
suppose,
Mm-hmm.
as well as speaking frankly about something as part of a public conversation in a
Yeah.
way that hopefully creates space for others to see themselves
Yes.
in the narrative,
Yes.
which was of course the motivation. And then it just being a controversial topic
Yeah.
is
Right.
obviously very, very difficult.
Throw that
So
in the mix. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So you saying that, I don't mean this glibly, is very meaningful, because
Right.
that was the hope and the intent. And
Mm.
hearing from, yourself or people who send me emails,
Mm-hmm.
that they saw something named
Yes.
that was not being named, at least hadn't been in their
Yeah.
experience, is part of, you're not, it's not just, vulnerability as a type of kind of emotional voyeurism or something
Right.
like that,
Right.
or
Right.
exhibitionism, I guess, is
Exactly.
what would
Yeah.
be,
No.
from me. But hopefully there's a telos and a goal for it.
Totally.
um
Well, it's crazy because there's so many complicated layers to this stuff. But what strikes me as I'm hearing you articulate that is like the narrative that men got off scot-free. It was just this like permission, like
mhm,
whatever. Um, that narrative has this weird effect of almost like gaslighting
yes.
people like us who are like, well, I don't feel like I got off scot-free, but I
Mm,
guess I'm being told I did, so I guess I can't really like deal with the baggage I have because I can't be honest about
yes.
it. And it perpetuates this idea that nobody else had the experience you had. And so I see you as kind of trying to like force like a crack in the dam of that narrative, so to speak, to try
Yeah.
to make room for other people to be honest and open. And it's not to say that all men who grew up in purity culture had the baggage that we have,
No,
but
definitely not.
anyways, you're just trying to make space for a narrative that, or a story, an
Mhm.
experience that needs to have some space that rightfully comes alongside all the other books that have already been written that have, I think, rightfully put light to the experience that many women have had. So that's really
Yeah.
what I'm trying to affirm in your project.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
let's talk about on this. I don't want to interrupt you, but I was going to say, like, let's talk about some of those harms. What are some of the
Sure.
harms that you put forward in the book that men specifically maybe have experienced in this movement?
Mm. Yeah. Well, the central one, I will start here.
Yeah.
The central one, it seems to me, is the vision of masculinity or male sexuality that is implicit or explicitly taught or described in so much of this purity culture rhetoric. So as I've already mentioned, people often think purity culture, Joshua Harris. But in my experience,
Right.
and I read Joshua Harris and I talk about Joshua Harris in the book a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but in my experience and talking with guys just in friendships, but also in preparation for writing this book, the book that always comes up is Every Man's Battle
Mm-hmm.
by Fred Stoiker and
Mm-hmm.
Stephen Arterburn.
Mm-hmm.
Which that series of books, I think it sold something ridiculous, like 6 million copies or something.
Wow.
And then there's
Wow.
Every Young Man's Battle.
That was the one I read. Yeah. Every Young
Oh
Man's Battle.
gosh,
Mm-hmm.
I have a conversation with Sheila Gregoire, who's one of
Mm-hmm.
the authors of The Great Sex Rescue, that's recorded. I think it's coming out tomorrow, if I'm not
Oh, okay.
mistaken, as we're recording this.
Yeah.
I was on her podcast to talk about my book, but then we have a conversation talking about Every Young Man's Battle that's coming out. So
Oh
maybe go
man, I'll
check
have to
that out.
look that up. Yeah, that's
Because
wow.
man, and I hadn't come back to that. So maybe I'll start here.
Yeah. Sounds good.
I hadn't come back to that book, the young man's battle one specifically, in a long time. But hearing Sheila just read some of these quotes, it's just egregious.
Mm,
This vision of maleness as and even like young maleness, this is marketed to like what, 12 to 16-year-old
right.
boys or something like that, as kind of these like helplessly and hopelessly erotic sex machines
Yeah.
that are at the mercy of their hormones
Mm-hmm.
and can only hope to live with integrity or in quote unquote purity through a massive amount of concerted effort and extremely rigorous guardrails
Yeah.
around their behavior.
Yeah.
Not so much just, hey, that's a kind of immature way of thinking about girls and women, and you should grow up and not do that anymore.
Right. Right.
Which is simplifying things a bit, but I
Mm-hmm.
actually think this idea that to be male is to be hypersexual
Right.
was a really, really damaging message that a lot of men who grew up in the generation that you and I did in the context that we did internalized, whether they realized it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I fear that this kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy oftentimes, where
Yeah.
imagine if you're hearing, as I did, kind of from a prepubescent context, that guys are obsessed with women's bodies, and you kind of get all those messages from the culture, but then it's reinforced actually
Right.
through the Christian resources that are commended to you, rather than replaced with a more humanized vision of what it means to be male.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think it actually set a lot of young men of our generation up to wallow in a certain type of adolescent immature expression of their sexuality.
Mm.
And it created a hypersexual script or a hypersexual ideal that young men felt they had to follow. And man, that's a deal, as
Yeah.
well as all of these kind of like high stakes messages around maintaining your purity. So on the one hand, you're like this animalistic
Yep.
sex machine. On the other hand, if you indulge in that at all, your life's over and you're screwed.
Yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
kind of crazy making. And then
Yeah.
throw kind of porn into that, throw just kind of like normal things that teenagers do into that.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, for guys, a lot of guys, led to a lot of really intense psychological mental health cycles of shame and things like that I know
Mm-hmm.
many people are carrying
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to this day.
Mm-hmm.
And if I hadn't had some wise mentors identify that for me and gotten some help beyond just accountability software and
Right.
groups and memorizing verses and rereading Every Man's Battle or whatever the case may be,
Yeah.
but digging into the deep kind of theological understructure, psychological substructure of what I had internalized and believed about maleness, I would perhaps be wallowing there too.
Yeah. What are some of those things you just alluded to them? What are some of those things that did help you start to shift, or maybe started to when the cracks started to show in the paradigm you'd inherited?
Yeah, well, part of it was, and again, I talk about this in the book, was the struggles in our marriage. Our
Yeah.
intimate life did not click from day one, it was clear, especially looking back. I think we were good. We followed the rules. We made it to our wedding, having never been intimate, and the kind of narrative of like hold off, white knuckle it, make it there, and then go nuts wasn't quite
Oh man,
working
yeah.
for us. And it was on my side of the equation, it was about this kind of internalized shame. And I found that I couldn't think about or participate or like even be like bodily present, I suppose, in a certain sense, to my sexuality
Yes.
without just triggering all these shame associations.
Yes.
And then for my wife Shelby, we weren't fully aware of thinking about it in these terms at the time, but we've come to understand and find out that she's a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And man, body keeps the score.
Yes.
That was a huge, huge dynamic in her just kind of obligatory, this is wifely duty, I'm going to
Right.
make myself available,
Yeah.
and me dealing with all my shame stuff on my side, and it kind of not working. But we had both internalized a narrative where kind of an intense experience of sexual desire is almost the male role. You will talk about gender roles,
Yes, I
and
was thinking about that.
a certain type of reticence and hesitation is the female role.
Right.
So if like I want sex a lot and she's kind of like, okay, whatever, yeah, sure, fine. We kind of just thought that's par for the course.
Right. Right.
Because and there weren't what should have been throwing up all kinds of red flags for us is like, hey, there's
Mm.
something dysfunctional happening
Yeah.
here. Actually
Yeah.
wasn't. And
Ugh.
then some of that started to hit the fan where it was just what was us kind of forcing it and trying to make it work together. I mean, there was a lot of love on both sides and trying to like figure this out. But it just got to a place where it wasn't working like
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in a conversation with my pastor about that, and in the way that these kind of conversations go sometimes where you're trying to be open but you're also like
Yeah.
self-withholding a little
Yeah.
bit,
Yeah.
and
Gauging how safe the space is. Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
Hmm.
But I was expecting something similar to the kind of every man's battle narrative of like
Hmm.
Zach, and I wasn't looking for him to um tell Shelby to figure her stuff out or anything like that, but I was genuinely like torn up because I felt like
Yeah.
I had all this sexual energy and nowhere to go.
Yeah.
And he just said, Zach, you ever thought that maybe you've been hypersexualized? And
Wow.
he's like, you probably have. And I don't say that with any sense of judgment,
Hmm.
but that's something for you to talk to somebody about. So
Yeah.
he, rather than get your accountability
Right.
together, which verses did you memorize? Oh, you missed this one, like add that into there. Like none of that. He just told me to go see a therapist.
Right.
Because he said the ways you're talking about this signals to me that there's some psychological stuff that needs to get dug into.
Wow.
Um, and through that experience and with that therapist, having learning to have some compassion and kindness for my sexual self and for
Yes.
my younger self, and thinking about some of those messages about my own body
Yeah.
that I had internalized, and family systems and all of this sort of stuff,
Hmm. Hmm.
that started me on a path towards something different.
Wow.
And yeah, and also just reading things. We've talked about these kind of purity culture deconstruction books, and this book isn't exactly in that category. But a meaningful book that Shelby and I read together was Kristen Dumay's Jesus and John Wayne,
Hmm.
which flagged for me, that book isn't zeroing in on the kind of sexuality and
Right.
eroticism angle that I am, though it touches on it a little bit, but it's tracing this kind of narrative of masculinity in
Hmm.
the evangelical church over the past, I don't know, 80 years or so, I guess,
Hmm.
Dumay traces. And that signaled to me that there's kind of a reactive cultural movement here centered on male identity that I inherited in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of got me thinking in a more critical lens on a lot of these things.
Yeah.
And looking back with a different, again, a different set of lenses on the books that I had read and things
Mm-hmm.
like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. There's a lot to unpack there potentially. Man, I so many things are like pinging my radar, I guess, in the thing you just laid out there, because there's an element, there is absolutely gender roles and family structure are
Sure.
huge in this. There's a sense of one's own acceptance of one's kind of embodied experience. That's a
Exactly.
huge element of this that can be so narrowly defined.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's masculine or feminine, whatever side, you want to talk about on that. My
Mm-hmm.
experience was very similar to yours in that I inherited an idea of a very strict and rigid idea of what it means to be masculine. And then when my
Mm-hmm.
experience did not neatly map onto that, I started to
Yes.
feel either not like a man or not man enough, or like something's
Yes.
wrong with you. And then there's a lot of shame that comes with acknowledging that
Yes.
to potentially do other men. And this is where the crazy making starts to happen. Like you're talking about,
Yes.
like these deep layers, talk about maturing. And one thing I love about your book is you go chapter by chapter in the last section through like what does a maturation process potentially look like in a healthy way.
Mm-hmm.
I love
Mm-hmm.
that. And I have two kids, and my older one is my son. So I'm going to be rereading those chapters as he continues to age. But just thinking about like internalizing these messages and processing the messages, and especially if you do them in isolation because of those shame dynamics as
Yes.
a young boy, like, gosh, I mean, it's no surprise that you get to your marriage
Mm-hmm.
and you have just a truckload of stuff that hasn't been
Mm-hmm.
healthily dealt with, And I had
Mm-hmm.
um, I can't go into I can't go into details like you did because I don't have permission from my wife. But
Sure.
I will say that for me, I just resonate so much with you, the specifics of your experience in terms of like white
Mm.
knuckling it, the
Mm-hmm.
getting to the marriage bed and the honeymoon, and
Mm-hmm.
just like being very confused as to why all the narratives I inherited were not playing out the way they were
Right.
supposed to.
Why isn't it coming together?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And and then at that point, it's not just about you. You are also participating in a dysfunction and potentially harm with another person. Which
Yes.
that for me was, and it sounds like similarly for you, that for me was a kind of bright light moment of like, okay, wait, this isn't just hurting me anymore. This is like
Yes.
hurting someone else.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyways, that's a little bit of my stream of consciousness response to everything you said.
Sure.
We could target kind of any one of those rabbit trails, but I guess one thing I'm thinking about is what would you say, because the phrase toxic masculinity, I think I like how your book
Mm,
plays on that. The phrase toxic masculinity is a little bit of a cultural buzzword right now.
for sure.
What would you say is specifically toxic about everything I just said? Basically the narratives we inherited, the purity culture, well-intended movement such as it was.
Mm-hmm.
What is toxic about that, would you say?
Yeah. Well, the way I kind of developed the toxic language and what is a helpful way of
Mm-hmm.
taking that, perhaps,
Yeah.
is this idea of dehumanization.
Yes.
So, you think about toxic, you think about poison, you think about
Mm-hmm.
something that makes you ill or kills you, radioactive, whatever the case may be. So I took that idea and kind of put it on this dehumanizing, rehumanizing taxonomy, where if sin is something that destroys and makes us less human,
Mm.
that those aspects of our sin nature, our cultural inheritance, our community systems, whatever the case may be, that tend towards that dehumanization are what I identify as toxic.
It's good.
So,
And flattening the experience of masculinity into you're just a bundle of hormones is a dehumanizing way to talk about men.
it makes men animals.
That's
We're
right.
not human. We're not
Mm-hmm.
human agents or
Right.
moral agents, rather.
Right.
we're not a little less than the angels. We're not created in the image of God. We are just, as someone recently said to me, like penises with a brain attached. And that's, just a really weird image, first of all. And also, like, but I think
But that is a
actually
functional
not,
anthropology.
yes, it is. And like, that's not entirely non-representative of the way a lot of people, a lot of Christians, a lot of men and women think about, this is a trope of sitcoms and rom-coms. And how many rom-coms is like, there's this guy who's like a total player, and then he like falls in love with a girl, and he's not a meathead anymore, and he's like, oh, maybe I can like have feelings in addition to just like having sex with people, I don't know. And there's like so what's toxic, it seems to me, is that Christians, Christians didn't invent toxic masculinity, but we are responsible for the ways that it kind of manifests within our communities and within our subculture, if you want to use that language. So there's this kind of like meathead hypersexual stereotype around straight masculinity, I'll just say, but it goes into kind of other like queer expressions of masculinity as well. But we've like baptized, and there's like a Jesus-y version of like the out of control hypersexual male. And man, that is really, really, really unhelpful, it seems to me. That rather than rejecting this kind of hypersexual, dehumanizing, reduces masculinity to the erotic vision of what it means to be male, Christians actually have too often like adopted that and endorsed it and said, guys, we know you want sex so bad, and the path to that is, like remaining abstinent, getting married, and then again go nuts. And that is actually just taking this dehumanizing hypersexual vision of masculinity and just like take your dehumanizing urges, keep them under wraps, and then just like dump them on your wife after you get married. It's just like really, really, really dangerous, it seems to me. And there's not a lot of mutuality there.
That's what I was thinking.
It goes into these gender roles where the wifely duty is sexual availability and passivity, and the male role is sexual kind of virility and aggression. And that's there's no mutuality there. Like sex is something a man does to a woman, which again has all of these like rapey ideas associated with it. So that is bananas,
that's toxic
and really, really not helpful. And
and the idea, oh man, my mind is spinning with implications of this now. Like the idea that, for a couple things, the idea that would be only limited to sexual behaviors and not affect the way that men and women think about themselves in the world more broadly. That seems, well, naive would be an understatement. And part of what I know, Dumay's book has gotten a lot of backlash and criticism and whatnot, but one thing that I think she nails in a really disturbing way is that last chapter where she talks about sexual scandal after sexual scandal after sexual scandal and cover up of abuse in this context of kind of hierarchical militant masculine ideals. I mean, that's, I think any critic of that book, at least I think would be a challenge to at least read that in its context and look at that last chapter and not say there's something here,
something going on
to be to be honestly grappled with. But nevertheless, I don't want to go too much into a tangent on all of that. I just wanted to say that's one thing, the idea that this would only be relegated to the sexual and the sexual ethics realm and not have any harm in broader societal kind of issues. That seems like way off base. The second thing to me, and this is what your book is helpfully teasing at and getting at, and what we're starting to get in this conversation, is, to me, there's another layer of toxicity, harm, danger when you start theologizing on top of this
100%.
uncritically adopted framework of what masculinity and femininity mean. And maybe this gets us to, I think in my email to you, I said this is the elephant in the room right now with Josh Butler and the Gospel Coalition. And, not trying to just name drop, but I am trying to specifically identify a particular flashpoint that's happening right now that I think gets back to all this stuff, because when you start theologizing around these ideas, like I said, uncritically, that to me starts to then dial up the potential danger, because then when you start
Yes.
infusing it with theological ideas that are supposed to be transcultural, transhistorical, universal in scope, that well, a lot of red flags start to go up for me. So I don't know. I just kind of talked through a lot. I would love to hear your response to any pieces of that.
Yeah, Josh Butler, what say you? The well, go back to Dumais quickly first,
Yeah, sure.
because the kind of way her book ends, in some way, is the way my book starts. Is
Mm,
like mine starts
that's
with
good.
a kind of laundry list of
Hmm.
really disturbing, when you kind of see it all in one place,
Yes.
of just sexual scandals and Ravi Zacharias
Hmm.
and Atlanta spa shootings and Bill Hybels, and just it goes on and on, and saying, and then raising the question, what gives, what's going on?
Yeah.
This seems to be a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
And um so I feel, I know we've already talked about Dumais, but I feel great indebtedness to her.
Mm,
And even the way she kind of sets up, a lot of interviews she's done, she gets a lot of flack, like, hey, you're just all criticism.
right.
And she's like, well, I'm a historian, like, I'm
Hmm.
telling on a story, like, you're the pastors, you're the theologians, you figure it out. And
Mm,
I honestly felt like a bit of a kind of fire in my bones,
mm,
hearing her say that in interviews. And
mm.
and the way she ends her book, talking about what's been done, perhaps it can be undone. So
Yes.
I hope my book can be just a small part of that.
Hmm.
But then to go to the Josh Butler thing, so I have not read Beautiful Union. And I hope to eventually. I genuinely don't know when I'll get to it, but I did read the excerpts that were available online,
Hmm.
as well as some reviews where people went more in depth and pulled things out and things like
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
Here's my concern. Not that he is theologizing about sex. It's not like that's out of bounds.
Sure.
And that's something that Christians have done for centuries, with some kind of wacky and
Mystical. Yeah.
interesting and mystical
Hmm.
interpretations. Some that I might see more value in than others,
Sure.
and also some just kind of weird and wonderful stuff as well.
Hmm. Hmm.
But so that's not the problem. And even talking with some level of frankness about sex, again, is not the problem.
Right.
But it seems to me that Butler's work, from my sense of it, is an evangelical appropriation of a Roman Catholic tradition,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Theology of the
that
body.
traces
Yep.
the theology of the body, that traces through Christopher West to Pope John Paul II.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and there's a lot of theological anthropology and underpinning going on in that Roman Catholic tradition that I don't know if we evangelicals are quite ready for.
Yeah.
um
Sure.
and it
I think that's fair.
and um and I think Butler's, I don't want to be unfairly critical,
Sure.
but I think Butler's book and the kind of response and ways of articulating this in a kind of evangelically pastory voice are some of the evidence of that.
Yeah.
And it in a kind of post Me Too, post Church Too context,
Yeah.
a lot of the kind of gratuitous imagery and theologizing and, like, let's carry the metaphor and see what happens on some of the details and the mechanics of sex, particularly imagery around semen,
I know. Yeah.
is like, it's not just being prudish, but it's like, it seems to me that it's not careful in a way that the biblical text and the biblical authors are very careful. And it's also sloppy and not, and a bit haphazard in a way, again, that John Paul is not. Like
Correct.
John Paul is very, very careful about this in a way that I don't quite see evidenced in Josh Butler's book, which is not to say
Yep.
he's not, it's theologically defunct and there's nothing of value there or anything like that. But I do read some of that. And as a guy who has spent, the last couple of years working through this, thinking
Yes.
about it, writing on it, it was pretty immediately apparent to me that is like, ugh, like that's not awesome. From the perspective of a perspective that I've tried to get inside, like the perspective of
Yeah.
female survivors of sexual
Yeah.
abuse and male survivors of sexual
Yeah.
abuse, for
Yeah.
that matter.
Yeah.
Like the kind of the sorry, I work hard when I'm talking about this to avoid anything that could be a double entendre sexually.
Yeah, I know. It's so tough.
So I almost I was about to say extending the metaphor, but
Oh,
but any sort of kind of sorry, just
it's all good. Yeah, I know. Then you can't think of any other word to use.
Yeah, exactly. But extending the metaphor,
pressing the metaphor, is that? I don't know if that's any better.
Yeah, maybe that's a little better. Extending metaphors about sex and sexuality and Christ and the church into this kind of like really speculative space that is like, I think undeniably when you read Butler's book, like there's a lot going on in the conversations about semen.
Yes.
Like taking that on the one hand, and then like there's a not insignificant segment of the population that have like traumatic experiences with semen.
Yeah.
And a not insignificant percentage of like people in the church who got some, and this is where I think my heart kind of beats fastest in a kind of like alarm bell sort of way.
Yes.
People in the church who have been abused or assaulted or traumatized in sexual relationships with that, and you already alluded to this earlier, with that spiritual veneer, this kind of like, this is God's design or God's authority, and then that gets thrown into this entire mess with semen and male embodiment and sex and aggression and all of these things. And then you're like, Jesus and sex and the church and generosity and receiving and all of this, man, I'm just so worried that that's not what we need right now. And to Butler's credit, he's trying to take something that we have a lot of shame around in our culture and in the church, and say like, there's something beautiful here. Let's like really lean into what is the created good and the beauty and the wonderful thing that is human sexuality. And I imagine if I were to talk to him, would say like, I want men to not have these shame associations with their embodiment or sex or sexual desire. And I just don't think this is it.
Yeah, man, that's exactly what I was thinking, is that I see, to kind of steel man his approach, so to speak, I see what he's trying to do as weirdly in line of the spirit of some of what we've been talking about, which is to reclaim sex in a unashamed, healthy, confident,
fully human way.
Exactly. Yeah,
that's my read as well.
And I think that is a commendable intention. But as we know, intentions do not always, or not the end game. And it is, I'm even thinking too, like for those of us, for those watching who might have no idea what we're talking about, this is, we're talking about a recent controversy that the Gospel Coalition published a segment of a book. And yeah, you can find it quickly enough if you start Googling these terms and these names. But what I'm thinking, and I want to actually maybe attempt to, and as we kind of run out of time, I want to attempt to connect this back to the purity culture thing, because I wonder, and I'm not the first to make this observation by any means, but you even say in your book, I think, that like a Josh Harris, weirdly, they're both named Josh. It just occurred to me. Josh Harris is, in many ways, you could read that whole movement as he was a product of forces beyond his control, and he was propelled into a position, that if it wasn't him, it would have likely been somebody else, because of these bigger generational things you're talking about baby boomers and their response to sexual revolution stuff. We don't have enough historical distance from our current moment to say with any certainty whether or not something similar is happening, but I can't help but wonder, is there something bigger happening that is putting some of these arguments into the limelight, that is more of a response to bigger cultural issues, wrestling with, maybe it is like wrestling with Me Too, Church Too. I don't know. I can't really hazard a clear guess, but I just wonder if it's not so much about Josh Butler per se. It's more
Hmm.
about these broader forces that are
Yes.
wrestling with sexuality and ways that
Yes.
we've mishandled sexuality in recent decades, trying to correct and maybe overcorrecting. And
Hmm.
I wonder, I guess all I'm trying to say is I wonder if in 20 years we're going to look at this Flashpoint moment in a similar way we can look at the Josh Harris Flashpoint. Like,
Hmm.
um, I don't know. I don't know if you do. Does that spark a response in you kind of as we get near the end of our conversation?
Um,
Because it seems to me that that relates to what you're trying to do with, like, let's reclaim a non-toxic masculinity. Let's take into account
sure.
all these cultural forces and let's try to pose a healthier way forward
I
towards maturity.
I think there's a battle currently happening over traditional understandings of sexuality.
Mm.
So whether you want to tie that to kind of queer liberation
Hmm.
or gender roles or in a traditional marriage or any number of things, I think, and as well as the sexual abuse crisis
Yep.
and the way that's a cultural conversation, I think all of
And
this is just
technology and contraceptives and I mean all that stuff
100%,
is, yeah.
100%. Yeah, and Roe v. Wade
Hmm.
and all of this stuff. So I just think all of this is on the table in a
Yeah.
really pronounced way right now.
Yes.
And people, and I count myself among them, people who take more traditional views around human sexuality,
Hmm.
that are kind of storied in the Christian tradition and then the Jewish tradition beyond that. There is some thinking we got to do, and
Hmm.
it it makes sense that uh people are putting stuff out there as they're
Hmm.
trying to work through that. I guess
Hmm.
that's all I'm gonna
Yeah.
say.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the fullness of time, if it reveals places where our thinking is shallow,
Yes.
that will be valuable.
Yes.
But we
Hmm.
need to we need to lean in and really like be willing to
Yeah.
uh, maybe excavate some of our traditions that especially as evangelicals we're woefully bad at historicizing ourselves, and
Hmm.
to looking to the deep wells of our traditions, and maybe this will help us get there.
And our theological anthropology is
Yes.
pretty thin.
Yeah.
Is a
Yes.
huge
That's
part
been a
of it.
big theme of this conversation, actually.
Yes.
Man, oh man. Well, I feel like we're just scratching the surface of this. I do see genuinely. I see you. I see what you're doing as a piece of that project to move this forward in a more thoughtful direction. And I said
Well,
this in
thank
my
you.
review of your book, but seriously, I'm not blowing smoke on this. I was refreshed by the range of types of sources you pulled on. I mean,
Mm.
like I said, you cite. I don't know if I've read a book that cited both Nadia Bolz-Weber and Carl Truman. So I mean, alone, if you know those names, that alone speaks to, I think, the breadth
I
of what you're
think I
trying to
put
do.
them into conversation in an endnote, if I'm not
I
mistaken,
think that's right.
too.
Yeah, I can't remember
Yeah,
exactly, but it struck
which
me
is
as,
funny.
yeah, and I think that's really valuable. So
Yeah,
thank
probably
you.
not going to be found at dinner parties together anytime
No,
soon, is
no,
my
probably
guess.
not.
But
Yeah. But thanks for your thoughtfulness in bringing that.
yeah,
And
thank
and
you.
is there anything as we close? Is there anything you want to point, other than to your book? Is there anything you want to point watchers to about projects you're working on, other podcasts you're doing, stuff like that?
Oh, yeah, I mean, my, keep an eye out for my PhD dissertation, coming to an academic publisher near you sometime in 2027 or 2028 or
Yeah,
something
yeah,
like that. I don't know.
yeah.
Lord willing, if it even gets published.
Yeah.
But yeah, almost no one will care about that because it's not related to anything that we've been
What are
talking
you
about right
researching?
now. I'm working on wages from God in Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity,
Oh,
particularly in the Apostle Paul and Matthew.
oh.
So
Well, I'm
completely just
interested.
not this at
Yeah,
all. So we'll get back on
that sounds good.
sometime in a few years. But yeah, I mean, folks who are interested in hearing a little more from me on all variety of things, I co-host a podcast for the organization that I work part-time for, the
Hmm.
Center for Pastor Theologians. So Pastor Theologians podcast, you can look me up there and
Great,
listen to me talk about theology and pastoral ministry and things like that.
great. Well, Zach, thank you. Thanks for your time. Seriously, really
Yeah,
appreciate
thank you.
this, and appreciate your book, and appreciate your posture you're bringing to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Joel.